Okay, for some reason my film just shut off, and we were at that point where by the time the CDC officials published their failure to confirm DeFrida's finding in not just one but four publications, and had written a letter to her boss suggesting she be fired, academic scientists were comparing DeFrida's to Joan of Arc. She had dared propose an infectious etiology for ME. She had dared to turn it into a real disease. I always thought a comparison with the mythological Cassandra more appropriate. DeFrida's then 75-year-old boss, Kaprowski, was a Polish immigrant of the 1930s and considered by many to be personally responsible for the European brain drain of the 1950s, during which scientists left Europe in droves for America. Many of them found a home at the Wistar Institute because they knew that in a free society, that is where scientists flourish, where their studies produce most results, in a free society. Kaprowski, who took a great interest in ME and characterized it as an infectious disease of the brain, told me he believed the National Institute of Health needed an institute akin in size and scope to the National Cancer Institute to fight ME and other burgeoning central nervous system diseases. Kaprowski believed all of them would turn out to have an infectious cause, much like polio and rabies, which is my, I don't know if any of you guys know this. This is what piqued my interest in vaccines. I'm allergic to vaccines, and I was told to no longer get any vaccines. And even though I was told to no longer get any vaccines, I still tried a second dose of the hepatitis B vaccine series. My symptoms are similar to my symptoms to penicillin. I'm allergic to penicillin. And they are very central nervous system sort of symptoms. So to me, when they finally said, no, we refuse to give you any more shots, you're allergic, do not take any more vaccines. Both me and my sister were having these symptoms, and hers were even worse than mine. She even had swelling in her throat. So that would mean she could have gotten an anaphylactic reaction. And another classmate of mine did have an anaphylactic reaction. And this crazy frenzy to make all vaccines mandatory, they almost killed her. This year, the last time she was in the hospital, a nurse came at her with a injection. No, it could have been a pain injection for all she knew, because she was having pain. But she happened to ask the nurse, what is that? And she said, well, it's your flu shot. She goes, who ordered that? She goes, well, your doctor did. And I'm going to tell you, I know from personal experience, it's a mandatory written order for the docs to just check right away. They checked that before they checked her chart, which said she was allergic. Her last reaction had been anaphylactic. Had she not, as sick as she was, stopped that nurse, she probably would have had another anaphylactic reaction, and in her current state, it probably would have killed her. So, yeah, I have a vested interest, and I have another reason to be interested, but I'm not at liberty to talk about that. I promised. DeFrida's tantalizing findings, demolished by the CDC research into the cause of ME, rapidly slid into a scientific equivalent of the Mojave Desert, where the disease lay like a corpse for 20 years, to be picked over by a scavenging psychiatric lobby, as patients call these still influential psychiatrists. The latter have turned ME into a winking euphemism they call bodily distress syndrome, characterized by medically unexplained symptoms, aka MUPS, MUPS, They have managed to persuade much of the medical establishment that cognitive behavioral therapy is an effective treatment. Certainly, talk therapy is less expensive to administer than a full-out research effort into the cause. That's how I felt after I took my nursing exam. I said, oh my gosh, I was ready for all this medically related questions to be thrown at me. And instead it was all psychiatric questions. And I came out of my nursing exam saying, who knew all you had to do was hold their hand and talk to them and everybody would get better? You ask my sister. You ask both my sisters. They will tell you I said that in 1986. Federal dollars to search for pathogenic etiologies would never be forthcoming. Nihilism settled over those rare iconoclastic clinical investigators, and even rarer scientists who continued to find the malady alarming. They returned to publishing papers about symptoms, things like pompously titled post-exertional malaise, the inevitable crash that occurs in patients who exert themselves, or impaired blood flow to the brain, or pathologically low blood pressure. There are today some 5,000 plus papers on abnormalities in ME that have appeared in scientific journals since the dawn of the 1980s. Yet government officials continue to tell reporters there are no biomarkers. With Swiftian logic, the same officials tell each other that excuse me, I have my tongue all tied up in my mouth. There are no biomarkers. With Swiftian logic, the same officials tell each other that the disease needs to be broken into myriad subsets because they insist it's simply unimaginable that everyone could have the same thing. A new way of saying, as did the CDC, Kiji Fukuda, 20 years ago, it will not be a case of Agent X causing disease Y. Why not, Fukuda? After meeting Judith Mikovits in London in the spring of 2009, I wondered, had the day of reckoning arrived? Would Mikovits be the scientist who would resolve this disease, or would she go down in flames? Without meaning to be cryptic, I believe the answer is a bit of yes on both counts. We have CDC proved this paper, Mikovits assured me in September of 2009, shortly before her study was published in Science. She might have been new to the disease, but she was well acquainted with its political history. Earlier in July, her work had held up beautifully when two AIDS experts at the National Cancer Institute called a secret meeting of top gamma retrovirus experts to deliberate on the matter. The government's primary concern is how to manage an unpredictable public once the news of XMRV and its possible relationships to cancer was publicized, and what to do about all those infected asymptomatic people, which could even be me. I'm asymptomatic, but I'm most likely infected. I've had some vaccines. Most of my immunity is natural, but I have had some vaccines. My husband had vaccines, and he also had cancer. Too many in my family have cancer, had cancer, are lying dead from cancer, dying from cancer. That's the piece of the data that scared everybody, Mikovits remembered. They didn't care about chronic fatigue syndrome. I know people who have that too, lots of them. 10 million people infected with the retrovirus of unknown pathogenic potential. In this country, by comparison, 800,000 people are infected with HIV. In the tumult that followed, a concern turned to scorn when several laboratories were unable to confirm the work. And in time, a persuasive argument was presented by an American scientist, initially a staunch Mikovits supporter, that XMRV was a man-made virus, a contaminant that had been spreading from laboratory to laboratory since the mid-1990s. Mikovits and her collaborators accepted the verdict on XMRV, but drowned out in the resulting furor and even ridicule was Mikovits' voice. She insisted that evidence for gamma retrovirus infection in ME remained strong and was deserving of continued study. As with HIV, she argued likely there were multiple strains of the pathogen, and she noted that her research supported that hypothesis. She also referenced another scientist, a reclusive interferon expert named Sidney Grossberg, who had been quietly pursuing his own discovery of a retrovirus in an ME patient since the early 1990s at the University of Wisconsin. Indeed, in May 2013, once XMRV was laid to rest, Grossberg published his observation that the pathogen was a member of the gamma retrovirus family. Specifically, it was a murine leukemia virus, as XMRV was believed to be. That sounds familiar, doesn't it? It was, he continued, distinct from XMRV. Grossberg went on to suggest that in future studies, his techniques be used to expand the detection of a subset of viruses related to the murine leukemia viruses. Would Mikovits have been treated as harshly as she was had she been a man? Probably. Certainly, it doesn't matter in those elite scientist groups. They just have egos too big, and they're not used to competing with people of the same caliber. I think it would have been the same. Certainly the discoverers of XMRV were men, and none of them suffered the malignant news coverage, internet hazing, or public drubbing she would suffer. Would journalists John Cohen and Martin Enserink of Science have tag-teamed Mikovits as they did in the summer of 2012 to produce an 8-page classic work of character assassination in September of 2011 in Science? Now, I'm going to disagree with Dr. Mikovits. I just think there's not enough female biochemists in that field. I really do. I think they would have come down just as hard on her had she been a guy, or had she been a girl. I really do. I don't think that it came down hard on her just because she was a girl. I just think she didn't have enough other girl scientists to look at her work. Enserink trailed Mikovits around Brussels and the university town of Leuven, Belgium, during a scientific conference there, and Cohen later followed her from California to Reno, apparently in large part to obtain her jail mugshot, which appeared on page 1 of their story. I witnessed Mikovits talk herself, hoarse with Enserink, over a period of days in an effort to explain her scientific methods and hypotheses. I failed to recognize a word she had said to him in the article that resulted. Hoarse voice will do that. My poor daughter gets laryngitis. Well, she used to every year when she was teaching. Her voice would go every time. I think it affects people with low voices more often than people with high voices, and Judith Mikovits definitely has a low voice. Or was it the fact that the public health establishment largely perceives ME as a disease of women? Oh boy, now there has been some discrimination. That's why they gave women hysterectomies, because they were hysterical. There was something in their womb. Yeah, it was called a hormone imbalance. Oh, so they just took out the womb. Yeah, that was it. No, that was not it. That's historically a proven fact. Yes, it is. That, and the fact that heart disease, they judged women on the same data that they had collected from men. They didn't study men and women separately in heart disease. And later, when they finally did start, when we got more women in the medical field, there were blatant apparent differences because we're not the same. There's two genders, and they're very different. My personal opinion. Don't come after me. I'm not gender phobic. There's only two genders, male, female, and they're very distinct. They're not the same. They need separate studies. Oh boy. A disease of women, resulting in derision and dismissal, not just of patients, but of scientists who seek to identify the etiology of their disease, especially if they too are women. As recently as December 2013, one newly retired NIH scientist was asked by a patient at a medical conference in New York City what the NIH leadership really thought about this disease. After a pause in which he seemed to be weighing his words, the scientist replied unsmilingly, "They hate you." Can the rocky history of an epidemic that so far has impacted 2 human generations be attributed to misogyny in the way foot dragging on AIDS during the early 1980s was attributed to homophobia? Or does the explanation lie with the CDC and the NIH imperative to save face with the need to avoid any admission that taxpayer-supported health agencies have failed so profoundly and for so long? Yes. Let's talk about that. When it's taxpayer, tax-funded, there should never be any biases. Never. Ever. When it's taxpayer, tax-funded. There should be separate studies for women and separate studies for men and separate studies for children and separate studies for toddlers, separate studies for infants, etc., etc., etc. No excuses, no questions asked when it's taxpayer funded. Okay, I'm going to get off my soapbox now. I hop up there once in a while. Don't I look big when I get up there? Oh, I gotta find my place now. Okay. Okay. Or does the explanation lie with the CDC and the National Institute of Health imperative to save face with the need to avoid any admission that taxpayer-supported health agencies have failed so profoundly and for so long? Or is it to do with the avoidance of the class action lawsuits Mikovits predicted? Probably both. We are not primed as a society to ponder whether these agencies are conspiring by default or purposefully to keep the population ignorant of real and present threats to our lives and the lives of our children. Oh, I'm quite sure there's a little bit of that going on to prevent panic. But I'm a girl of, I like real. I like the truth. Don't give me the fantasy stories. I want the truth. The history of this disease, however, and the often devastating experiences of scientists who have tried to crack the case force any thinking person to consider that possibility. Aside from the fact that if you don't finally own up to what the real cause is, there's going to be more cases and more cases and more cases. What are we going to do? Wait until it completely wipes out humanity? This does not seem wise. What cannot be disputed? Judy Mikovits changed a stale quarter-century debate about the legitimacy of ME to a conversation about its biological cause, its modes of transmission, and rational drug therapies. She really does have drug therapies that have been helping people. That's the good news. She continued with her studies and developed therapies that are demonstrating helping people with chronic fatigue syndrome recover. And she gives out her email yet to this day because she wants to help people who have chronic fatigue syndrome. She's a hero in my book. I don't care what anybody else says. She reopened the Pandora's box that was slammed shut when the CDC attempted to bury Elaine DeFreitas. She made the disease real for a while, a momentous feat in itself, and moved the focus of the scientific community away from its symptoms towards its cause. She broke the spell of nihilism. She also proposed a reasonable hypothesis about a possible infectious agent driving the autism epidemic in a rational world. Her hypothesis would be pursued aggressively, more broadly. Good, bring it. Mikovits brought a once quiet, even esoteric conversation among molecular and evolutionary biologists out of the closet and into the mainstream. That's a Donnybrook. Is it possible that one virus or a closely related family of viruses might be causing the neurological diseases such as chronic fatigue syndrome, autism, even possibly ALS? I know people who have died of that. And Parkinson's disease? I have loved ones who have that. As well as the epidemics of non-Hodgkin's lymphoma and leukemia, I have loved ones who have died of that. Bring it, Judy, bring it. Let's start boxing. Thankfully, to her credit, there are a number of male biochemists who are taking on her cause. I like Dr. Shiva especially. He produced it. He's a genius. He produced a cell that is the model of a human cell with all the human cell components, and it is designed to react the way a human cell would in case something is introduced to that cell. So if we put vitamin C, it will show how vitamin C is reacted in a human cell. It shows what happens to it. If you put in a sugar molecule, it shows what that cell does with the sugar molecule. And it puts like the composition of these viruses in there, and it shows how the human cell reacts to those viruses. Why is this important? Who cares about that? If you care about animals being used to study diseases, to study medications, animals that if we grow vaccines in can lead to retroviruses, what if we could put it in a cell, an artificial intelligence cell model instead? We won't pick up any retroviruses in there. We'll only gain knowledge, and finally, maybe a safe vaccine. Even Dr. Judith Mikovits will freely admit, it's not that I'm against vaccines. I'm against unsafe vaccines. And I have a whole bunch of people behind me, and a lot of them are nurses. And some of them are nurses who have had to resuscitate a child after a vaccine. No one should ever have to resuscitate a child after a vaccine. So you can come at me all you want. Call me an anti-vaxxer. I don't care. It's one of the most thankful things I'm thankful to God for. I don't care. You need to see my house? I don't care if it's not like the Joneses or the Smiths. I'm happy and comfortable here. So is my husband. It's where we live, not where we show off. I don't care what you think of me. I just care about what's the truth, what's the right thing to do. So, we read this book. I want my family to stop dying of leukemia. I want dear young friends to stop dying of ALS. I want family and friends to stop dying of cancer. I don't want to see one more family member suffering from chronic fatigue syndrome. Yeah, we need to move forward, and we need to be honest. One hopes for greater honesty. Imagine that coming right after my big speech again on my soapbox. And a new spirit of open-mindedness from government officials in the future when so many are sick and the cost of the culture is so high. Every discovery should be examined and explored without bias and with great urgency. Honest scientists need to know they will be supported in their endeavors to solve difficult problems rather than burned at the stake. One hopes, too, for the salvation of the millions of people who have been disappeared by their governments for having acquired a disease that cannot be acknowledged by those governments, and those who will become ill in the years ahead if there is a return to the status quo that Judy Mikovits disrupted for 3 brilliant years. And that's the end of the foreword. In my next video, which will be, I think, my 4th, we will actually start the book. Okay, we're reading Plague. And Plague is written by Kent Hagen-Lively and Judith Mikovits, PhD. Okay. All right, you guys. Good night.